Sophie's voice came up the stairs first, small and strange, the way a child's voice sounds when it's carrying something too heavy for it. Mom. Whose phone is this? My name is Meredith, Mir, to almost everyone who's known me more than a week, and I was 41 years old, standing in the laundry room folding my husband's undershirts into the same soft stack I'd folded for 16 years, when my daughter's question rearranged the rest of my life. I want to tell you what came before that moment, because you need to understand what I was folding laundry inside of. Not a perfect marriage. Not even, if I'm honest with you now, a marriage I fully trusted. But a marriage that had survived things. One thing, I'd told myself for years, 1 week a decade ago, that we'd both agreed to bury and never dig up again. I believed that burial had held. I built 16 years of Tuesdays on top of it. Patrick and I met at 25, in a bar in Charlotte during a wedding neither of us particularly wanted to attend, and there had been a version of him then, funny, a little reckless, generous with attention in a way that made you feel like the only person in a crowded room, that I still, even now, 2 years past the end of us, find myself missing at strange hours. That's the part people don't always want to hear in these stories. I didn't marry a monster. I married a man I loved completely, who became, slowly and then all at once, someone I couldn't recognize. Sophie was 12, sharp-eyed and quiet in the particular way of children who've learned to read a room before they've learned much else. She was down in the mudroom that Tuesday afternoon looking for her own phone charger, and what she found instead, wedged behind the boot bin where her father kept a gym bag he swore he actually used, was a second phone. Black case, no fingerprint lock set up yet, sloppy, the sloppiness of a man who'd gotten away with things long enough to stop being careful. I came down the stairs with a shirt still balled in my hand. It was just sitting there, Sophie said, holding it out to me like something that might be contagious. It kept buzzing. I thought maybe it was an emergency phone, for work or something, so I looked. I want to stop here and tell you something honest. For about 4 seconds, standing on that bottom step, I still believed there was an explanation. That's how deep 16 years goes. For seconds of believing, against everything already visible on the screen in my daughter's hand, that this was going to turn out to be nothing. It was not nothing. We'd built a good life by any outside measure. Patrick had climbed from regional rep to regional sales director for a building materials company, the kind of promotion that came with a company car and a title people said with a small note of respect at dinner parties. I taught art at Weaverville Elementary, 12 years running, the kind of job that filled me up in a way I didn't always know how to explain to people who measured success differently. We had the house on Registry Drive, the one with the wraparound porch Patrick had built himself the summer Sophie turned 7. We had, on paper, everything. What we also had, what I'd allowed myself to compress into a single sealed year a decade back, was the affair. Her name was Christine. She worked in his old office, in Charlotte, before the promotion moved us to Asheville. I found out the way most women find out those things, not from a confession, but from a slip, a receipt, a look that lasted a half-second too long at a company picnic. Patrick had cried. Real tears, I believed then and mostly still believe now. He begged. We did 6 months of counseling with a therapist named Dr. Voss who had a gentle voice and a habit of asking me what I needed instead of what I forgave, a question I never quite learned to answer honestly. I forgave him faster than the 6 months should have allowed. I told myself that was strength, that holding a grudge was its own kind of poison, that real love metabolized pain instead of storing it. I was proud of how quickly I moved past it. I told my sister Denise that Patrick and I were stronger now, actually, and I believed the sentence as I said it. Looking back now, that speed wasn't strength. It was fear wearing strength's clothes, fear that if I sat with the pain long enough to really feel its size, I'd have to admit how much of my life was built on top of it. That's not something I understood at the time. I understood it much, much later, standing at the bottom of a staircase with my daughter holding a stranger's phone that belonged to my husband. Denise had been there through all of it, that first time. She'd sat with me on my kitchen floor the week I found out about Christine, held my hand while I cried in a way I hadn't cried since our father's funeral. Denise was 45, divorced once herself, sharp-tongued in the way older sisters get to be, and I trusted her the way you trust someone who watched you grow up, someone whose loyalty you've never once had reason to question. I didn't know, that year, or for years after, exactly how much Denise actually knew. I know now. I didn't know it then. That gap, between what my sister knew and what she let me believe, turned out to be its own kind of wound, separate from Patrick's, and in some ways slower to heal. The mini cliffhanger, if you want to call it that, isn't dramatic. It's smaller and worse than that. Standing in that mudroom, phone screen glowing faintly against Sophie's palm, I saw a name I didn't recognize, Danielle, and beneath it, a single preview line visible on the lock screen that made the floor tilt very slightly under my feet. I took the phone from my daughter's hand as gently as I could manage, and I told her, in a voice I didn't entirely recognize as my own, to go finish her homework. She went. Children are better at reading a room than we give them credit for. She didn't ask a single question on her way up the stairs, though I know now she'd already started building her own private theory of what she'd just handed me. I stood alone in the mudroom for a long time before I unlocked the phone. Long enough that the light through the small window had shifted color. Long enough that I heard, faintly, my own heartbeat in the quiet the way you only hear it when something in your body already knows before your mind catches up. The phone wasn't locked beyond a basic passcode, and it took me 3 tries, Sophie's birthday, my birthday, our anniversary, before it opened on the 4th, which was, absurdly, his mother's birthday. I sat down on the mudroom bench with my coat still half on and I read. It wasn't Danielle alone. That was the part that took the longest to fully land, not the existence of an affair, which some sealed-off corner of me had almost been braced for since Christine, but the sheer architecture of it. There were 3 separate threads on that phone, 3 different women, 3 different tones of voice Patrick had learned to speak in depending on who he was speaking to. Danielle, current, warm and easy, 3 months of messages. An older thread, mostly deleted but not entirely, with someone named K, that referenced a hotel in Charlotte from 18 months back. And one more, recent, overlapping with Danielle by several weeks, with a woman whose contact photo showed her laughing at something just off camera, a woman I recognized, with a slow, sick drop in my stomach, as someone from Patrick's gym. 4, counting Christine. 4 women across 16 years, and I had known about exactly one of them. I didn't cry in that mudroom. I want you to understand that, because I think it matters. The crying came later, in pieces, over weeks. What I felt sitting on that bench was something colder and stranger, a kind of vertigo, like discovering that a house you'd lived in for 16 years had a second floor you'd never once noticed, rooms you'd walked past 1,000 times without ever trying the door. Something in me went very still in that moment, not shock, exactly. Something closer to recognition. As if some quiet, unacknowledged part of me had known this house had more rooms than I'd let myself count. I put the phone in my coat pocket. I didn't confront him that night. Patrick was traveling, Greensboro, a supplier meeting, back Thursday, and some part of me, some part I'm still working out how to forgive, decided I needed more than one glowing screen before I set fire to 16 years. I told myself I was being careful. I was also, if I'm honest, terrified. Life went on that week with a surreal, muffled quality, like watching myself from slightly outside my own body. I made dinner. I graded a stack of second-grade self-portraits, all crayon and confidence, and found myself staring at one for a full minute without seeing it, my mind somewhere else entirely. I answered Patrick's nightly call, "Miss you, how's my girls?" in a voice that sounded, to my own ears, almost convincingly normal. I called Denise on Wednesday. Not to tell her everything, I wasn't ready for that yet. Some protective animal instinct kept the full truth folded close to my chest, but because I needed, badly, to hear a voice that had known me longer than Patrick had. "You sound off," Denise said, halfway through a conversation about nothing. "Everything okay with you too?" I remember the pause on the line after she asked it. Just half a second too long. I didn't catch it then, I was too far inside my own static to hear anyone else's. But I'd think about that half second later, turn it over the way you turn over a coin looking for the mint mark, wondering how long it had been sitting in her hand before I ever asked the question. "Fine," I said. "Just tired." I didn't ask her the real question, not because I didn't want to know, but because some part of me was already bracing for an answer I couldn't carry on top of everything else that week. The dinner on Thursday, when Patrick came home, was ordinary in a way that felt obscene in retrospect. He kissed the top of my head the way he always did, dropped his bag by the door the way he always did, asked Sophie about her science fair project with what looked, infuriatingly, like real interest. I watched him move through our kitchen with the fluency of a man who'd never once had to think about where the plates were kept, and I understood, watching him, that I was looking at two different people occupying the same body, the one I'd married, and the one I now knew things about that he didn't know I knew. I noticed, that night, a small thing I'd have dismissed a week earlier. He checked his work phone twice at the dinner table, quickly, angling the screen slightly away from me out of what I now recognized as old habit rather than new caution. A tell so practiced it had stopped looking like one. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever sat across a dinner table from someone, smiling, passing the salt, while a second version of the truth sat in your coat pocket upstairs, you know exactly what that particular silence weighs. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself I was gathering strength. I think, now, I was also gathering the last few days I'd ever have of not knowing what I now knew for certain, one final stretch of the marriage I believed I had, even while holding proof in another room that it had already stopped being real. The unease that had been a single sharp thing in the mudroom widened, over the following weeks, into something more diffuse and harder to fight, the low, constant hum of living two lives at once, one visible to Patrick and one entirely hidden from him. I started noticing patterns I'd trained myself, over a decade, not to see. The Thursday, supplier check-ins, that always ran 2 hours longer than the ones on any other day of the week. The gym membership he'd upgraded to a plan with extended evening hours right around the time, I now understood with sick clarity, the affair with the woman from his gym had likely started. The way he'd started keeping his phone face down on the counter, a habit I'd once read as consideration, not wanting the screen to light up and bother me, that I now understood as something closer to a magician's sleight of hand, performed so smoothly he probably didn't even register doing it anymore. I went looking, once the initial shock steadied into something colder and more methodical. I want to be honest about this part, because it's not flattering. I went through his email on a Sunday morning while he was at the hardware store, using a password I'd guessed years ago and never mentioned I knew. I found nothing damning there. He was more careful with email than with the burner phone, but I found something else. Something that widened the whole picture in a direction I hadn't expected. An old folder, half forgotten, labeled simply, Receipts 2019. Inside it, a hotel confirmation for a night in Charlotte, the same week as a work conference I remembered clearly, because I'd driven Sophie to a soccer tournament that same weekend and Patrick had called twice to check in, sweet and attentive, from a hotel room I now understood he hadn't been alone in. That was the K thread. Confirmed, dated, sitting in an inbox I'd never once had reason to search before. That folder should have ended everything the moment I found it. It didn't. It took me another 6 weeks to understand why I wasn't leaving the second I had proof, and the truth wasn't love. It was the terror of what I'd become if the life I'd built my whole identity around turned out to have been built on ground that was never solid to begin with. I photographed everything on my own phone. Then I closed the laptop, put the kettle on, and made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink, sitting at the kitchen table in the particular quiet of a house where nobody else knows what you just learned. If you've ever gone looking for proof you were half afraid to find, and then sat with it in silence for weeks rather than saying the words out loud, you already know something about me I didn't fully understand about myself yet. I called Denise again, 3 weeks in, and this time I told her everything. Not gently. I sat in my car in the elementary school parking lot after the last bus pulled out and I said it plainly, the way you rip a bandage rather than peel it, Danielle, K, the hotel receipt, the woman from the gym. 4, I told her. 4, counting Christine. There was a silence on the line that went on too long. Denise? I'm here, she said, and her voice had changed, gone careful, gone smaller, in a way I'd never heard from my sister before. Mir, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything. Something tightened in my chest before she'd said another word. Some animal part of me already understood, before my mind caught up, that whatever came next was going to cost me something I hadn't budgeted for. I knew about Kay, Denise said. Not, I didn't know her name, not until just now. But I knew there was someone, back in 2019. Patrick told me. He was drunk, at Mom's birthday, and he told me because he needed someone to tell, and he made me promise not to say anything, and her voice caught. I told myself it wasn't my place. That it would only hurt you, and it might not happen again, and it wasn't my secret to break. I sat in that parking lot with my hands gripping the steering wheel of a car that wasn't moving, and something in me that had been holding steady for 3 weeks finally, quietly, gave way. "You've known for 5 years," I said. It wasn't a question. "I've known about one of them for 5 years," Denise said. "I swear to you, Mir, I didn't know about the others. I didn't know about Danielle. I didn't know it kept happening." I didn't say anything else that day. I hung up, sat in the parking lot until the light changed color again, and drove home to make dinner for a daughter who still, as far as I knew, believed her family was intact. I hadn't put together, until that call, exactly how much of my marriage had been managed on my behalf by people who loved me, how many small silences, from how many directions, had quietly decided together that I didn't need to know the size of the thing I was living inside. If you've ever found out that someone who loves you decided, on your behalf, what you could handle knowing, you understand there's a particular kind of loneliness in that. It's not the betrayal itself. It's finding out how many people were standing around the edges of it, watching, while you were the only one who didn't know. By the 6th week, I was living inside a version of myself that felt thinner than the one I'd started with. Sleep had become a negotiation I mostly lost. I'd lie beside Patrick, listening to the easy, untroubled rhythm of his breathing, and do math in the dark. 16 years, for women, 1 sister, 1 daughter who still didn't know any of it. I stopped eating breakfast most mornings, not from any decision but from a simple lack of appetite that arrived and didn't leave. My hands had developed a small, persistent tremor whenever I picked up Patrick's phone to charge it, an old domestic habit that had turned, without my consent, into something closer to reconnaissance. I caught myself, twice, standing in the pantry with the door open, unable to remember what I'd gone in for. Patrick, for his part, seemed almost entirely unaware that anything in our house had shifted. Almost. There were cracks, in hindsight, small tells I'd have missed completely if I hadn't already been looking. He'd started leaving his work phone in the car more often, a habit shift I clocked immediately. He over-explained a late night that nobody had asked him to account for, an unprompted alibi that landed strangely in a normal conversation about his day. Once, changing his shirt before bed, he flinched, when I reached toward the pocket of the shirt he'd just taken off, before catching himself and turning it into an easy laugh about being ticklish. I noticed it. I filed it away, the way I'd filed away 100 small things over 16 years, and I told myself, one more time, that it was nothing. That habit, the one where I saw something and decided not to look at it directly, had kept this marriage running for a decade. It had also, I was starting to understand, been keeping something else running the entire time, underneath it. She told me, much later, what was going through his mind during that stretch, though it took him months after everything to say any of it plainly. I knew something was different by then. I couldn't have told you what, exactly. Mir wasn't different in any way I could point to. She still made dinner, still asked about my day, still laughed at the same jokes. But something in the air of the house had shifted, and some old animal part of me clocked it the way you clock a change in barometric pressure before you can name it as a storm. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself, the way I always told myself, that this was the last time, that I'd end things with Danielle before it went any further, that I just needed a little more time to figure out how to do it without hurting anyone. I'd told myself some version of that sentence for 16 years. I still believed it, every single time I said it. I didn't know yet that the timeline had already run out. I confided fully in my closest friend outside the family, a woman named Priya I'd known since Sophie's kindergarten pickup line. The two of us bonded over shared exhaustion and dark humor about our respective husbands' domestic blind spots. I told her everything, the whole architecture of it, sitting in her kitchen with 2 untouched glasses of wine between us. "You have to tell him you know," Priya said. "Every day you don't, he thinks he's getting away with it. That's its own kind of damage, Mir, to yourself, I mean, not to him." I knew she was right. I also knew I wasn't ready, and there is a particular exhaustion in knowing exactly what the right next step is and still not having the strength to take it yet. By the end of part 4's stretch of waiting, I had, without fully deciding to, gathered everything I needed. The photographs of the texts. The hotel receipt. A screenshot, taken carefully and reluctantly, of the third woman's face beside her name in Patrick's contacts. I had it all saved in a folder on my own phone labeled, with a dark humor I didn't know I still had access to, recipes. I came close to showing it all to Patrick one night, halfway through an ordinary argument about nothing, whose turn it was to call the plumber, that had, for a moment, opened a door I could have walked through. I had my phone in my hand. I had the folder open. And then Sophie called down that she couldn't sleep, and the moment closed as quickly as it had opened, and I told myself it wasn't the right time yet, that I needed a plan, not an outburst. Looking back, I know now that wasn't strategy. It was the same old habit, dressed in new clothes, the part of me that had always needed the room to stay calm more than it needed the truth to be spoken. I put the phone away. I said goodnight to Sophie. And the folder labeled recipes sat unopened for 11 more days, waiting for a moment I kept promising myself would come. I know some of you already sense where this is heading. I didn't, not fully. I only knew that something in me had stopped being willing to carry this alone much longer, whether I was ready or not. The 11 days ended the way the whole thing had started, not on my terms, but through Sophie. She'd been quieter than usual since the mudroom, in a way I'd noticed and told myself was just the ordinary weather of being 12. What I hadn't known was that she'd been carrying her own private theories since that day, turning it over on her own, the way children do when adults think they've successfully hidden something. It was a Saturday. Patrick was home, working in the garage on something that didn't need doing, and Sophie found me in the kitchen and asked, in a voice too steady for a child, "Is Dad cheating on you?" I set down the mug I was holding very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid might shatter if handled wrong. "Why would you ask that?" I said, buying time I didn't actually have. "Because I looked at the phone again," she said. "Before you took it. I saw the name. And I looked her up on Instagram, and there were pictures of her at Dad's work Christmas party last year, and I didn't say anything because I thought maybe I was wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong." Something in me broke open at that moment, differently than the mudroom had broken it, not shock this time, but grief, sharp and immediate, for the fact that my daughter had been carrying this same weight in silence, at 12 years old, for the same 6 weeks I had. I didn't lie to her. I want you to know that, because it's the one thing I'm proud of from that whole stretch of the story. I sat her down at the kitchen table and I told her, in language careful enough for a 12-year-old but honest enough to actually mean something, that yes. That her father had made choices that had badly hurt our family, more than once, and that I was still figuring out what came next, and that none of it, was in any way her fault or her job to fix. We had that conversation with the garage door still audible, the low hum of Patrick's radio drifting through the wall, entirely unaware that the last few private hours of his marriage were running out on the other side of it. I called Denise that afternoon. I told her it was time, that I wasn't going to hold this alone anymore, and that I needed her there, not to defend me, but because if she was ever going to make right the years of silence, this was where that started. She came within the hour, and I could see, the moment she walked through the door, that she understood exactly what kind of afternoon this was going to be. Patrick came in from the garage around 5, oil on his hands, calling out something ordinary about dinner, and stopped in the kitchen doorway the moment he saw the three of us sitting at the table, me, Denise, and, at my insistence, Sophie upstairs but within earshot, because I had decided, in the last hour, that I was done managing what my daughter was and wasn't allowed to hear about her own family. He read the room fast. Patrick was good at reading rooms. It was half of what made him good at his job, and something in his face rearranged itself into careful neutrality. "What's going on?" he said. Not quite a question. I didn't raise my voice. I set my phone on the table, screen up, the folder open, the texts, the hotel receipt, the screenshot from the gym, and I let it sit there between the salt shaker and a stack of unopened mail, exactly the way I'd imagined doing it for 11 days. "For," I said. "That I know about. Danielle. The woman from your gym. Whoever Kay was, in 2019, at that hotel in Charlotte the same weekend I was at Sophie's soccer tournament. And Christine, 10 years ago, which I already knew about, which I forgave, which I built the rest of this marriage on top of like it was solid ground. I watched something move behind his eyes, not the collapse I might have expected, not tears, not an immediate confession. Something colder and quicker, calculation. "Where did you get this?" he said, and even in that sentence I could hear him deciding, in real time, which direction to take the conversation. "That's what you're going to ask me," I said, and I felt something rise in me I hadn't fully expected, not the calm precision I'd rehearsed in my head for 11 days, but something rawer. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Let me explain." "You're asking where I got the proof, like the proof is the problem." "I'm not saying that," Patrick said, and his voice sharpened, defensive now, finding its footing. "But you went through my things, Mir. You've been building a case against me for weeks, apparently, instead of just talking to me like an adult. What was I supposed to do, guess that you already knew and were just waiting? You were supposed to not cheat on me 4 times in 16 years, I said, and I heard my own voice climb in a way it almost never did, something in me finally, completely unwilling to soften the truth to make the room easier for him. You don't get to make my silence the crime here. I know exactly what I did and didn't do wrong in this marriage, Patrick, and going through a phone my own daughter found in the mudroom is not on that list. You've never once considered what it's like to be married to someone who's checked out for years, he said, and I felt the old grain of truth in it land somewhere tender, the way it always had, the late nights I'd spent grading papers instead of talking, the years I'd poured into Sophie and the classroom and told myself the marriage could run on autopilot. I'm not saying it excuses anything. But you weren't exactly present either, these last few years. You want to sit here and be the only wronged person in this house? Denise, beside me, went very still, the kind of stillness that isn't peace but restraint. I felt, for one destabilizing moment, the old undertow of it, some part of me already turning inward, already wondering what I'd missed, what I'd failed at, whether the years of exhaustion I'd chalked up to teaching and motherhood had actually been a door I'd left open for this. I came in as the wronged party. For one terrible half-minute, I left the conversation feeling somehow implicated, and that, I understood later, was exactly the machine he'd built without ever consciously deciding to build it. I didn't let it hold. Something in me, newer than I expected, pushed back against the old current. "No," I said, quiet now, but not soft. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to turn 16 years of my exhaustion into an excuse for your choices." I was tired because I was raising our daughter and grading 140 portraits every semester and holding this house together while you were in hotel rooms with other women. Those aren't the same thing, and I am done letting you make them sound like they are. He didn't respond to it. "And I have finally spoken to you," this is what he told me, once he'd run out of angles to redirect the conversation, when Denise finally spoke. "I knew about Kay," Denise said, into the silence that followed, her voice cracking on the first word. "I've known since 2019, Patrick. You told me, at Mom's birthday, and I never said a word, and I have hated myself a little more every year since, and I am done being quiet for you." Patrick's face did something I hadn't seen from him yet that afternoon, genuine surprise, and beneath it, something close to fear. "Denise. Don't," she said. "I protected you for 5 years because I told myself it wasn't my secret to tell, and the whole time I was really protecting myself from how it would feel to break my sister's heart with information I already had. That's on me. I'm going to spend a long time making that right with her. But I am not carrying it for you anymore, not for one more second." What came next wasn't the immediate breakdown I might have expected from a man cornered this completely. Patrick's face worked through something, anger, then something closer to exhaustion, and when he finally spoke again, it wasn't a denial. It was, unprompted, something closer to an unraveling. "You want to know how it started," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier sharpness, gone rougher, quieter. "Fine. You want to know, I'll tell you." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, elbows on the table, and for the next several minutes he talked in a way I had never once heard him talk in 16 years of marriage. It started with Christine because I was 29 years old and terrified I'd already peaked. You remember that year, I'd gotten passed over for the regional job, the first time, and I felt like I was disappearing. Christine looked at me like I was still someone worth looking at. That's it. That's the whole embarrassing truth of it. It wasn't about you. It was never about you, not really, not any of them. It was about needing someone to prove to me I still mattered, because some part of me has never once believed that on its own. After Christine, after we did the counseling and I promised you, I meant it. I want you to know I meant it, in the room, in that moment. I told myself I'd never do it again, and I believed it completely for almost 4 years. Then Kay happened at a conference where nothing was supposed to happen, and I told myself it was a one-time thing, that it didn't count the way Christine counted because it was just physical, and I know now how disgusting that math sounds, but that's the actual lie I told myself to survive doing it. I told myself that as long as I never let it become something real, it wasn't really breaking my promise to you. The woman from the gym, I don't even have a story for that one that makes sense out loud. I was bored, and flattered, and I told myself I deserved something for myself after years of being the guy who provides and shows up and never asks for anything. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. It's just the truth of what I was thinking, which I understand now is somehow worse than if I'd had a real reason. Danielle was, the one I actually started to feel something real for, and that's the part that scares me most to say out loud, because it means I wasn't just weak, I was actually building a second life, piece by piece, for months, while coming home every night and eating dinner with you and Sophie like nothing was happening. I'd feel it sometimes, at the table, some sick lurch in my chest, and I'd tell myself I'd end it that week. I told myself that every week for 3 months. I was so afraid of you finding out that I stopped being able to enjoy any of it toward the end. I was afraid all the time, of my phone, of a receipt, of Sophie walking into the wrong room at the wrong moment, which I guess is exactly what happened. And underneath the fear there was something worse, which is that some part of me almost wanted to get caught, because I didn't know how to stop it myself, and some sick part of me was hoping you'd do it for me. I don't know how to make this right. I don't think there is a way to make this right. But I need you to know it was never that I didn't love you. It was that I never learned how to believe I deserved to be loved without proving it to myself over and over, with people who didn't actually know me, in rooms that didn't cost me anything real, until they did. He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Denise had tears on her face she wasn't bothering to wipe away. Upstairs, faintly, I could hear the specific, careful quiet of a 12-year-old who had been listening to every word. I didn't cry. I sat very still, and I felt something in me that had been braced for 16 years finally, quietly, let go of its grip. "Thank you for telling me the truth," I said. "It doesn't change what happens next. But thank you." Patrick moved out 3 weeks later, into an apartment across town that I never once saw the inside of. The divorce took the better part of a year. Asheville has a slow docket, and Patrick, to his credit, never fought me on anything material, as if some part of him understood there was nothing left to negotiate for. He lost more than the house. He lost, within months, the easy social standing he'd built over 16 years in that town, word travels, in a city that size, and the men he golfed with grew quietly, permanently cooler once their wives heard the full shape of what he'd done. He lost, more than anything, the version of himself he'd spent his whole life trying to prove existed, the man worth choosing, worth staying for, worth loving without qualification. In the end, 4 different women had confirmed, over 16 years, exactly the opposite of what he'd been chasing, that he could not, in fact, hold on to anything he told himself he wanted, because he'd never learned how to want without also needing an exit. Denise and I are still rebuilding what broke between us. It's slower than I expected. 5 years of silence doesn't undo itself over a few tearful conversations, however sincere. She shows up now in ways she didn't before, small and consistent, driving Sophie to practice, calling just to check in, never again the kind of silence that protects someone at my expense. I believe she's sorry. I've told her that belief doesn't erase the 5 years. Both things are true at once, and I've stopped needing them not to be. I understood something, standing in my kitchen the week the divorce was finalized, that reached past just my own marriage, that forgiving quickly isn't always grace. Sometimes it's just fear, wearing Grace's better clothes, buying time instead of buying peace. I had spent a decade being proud of how fast I healed. I understand now that speed was never the point. Whether the healing was real, that was always the only question that mattered. Sophie is 14 now. She talks about that Tuesday sometimes, in the careful, matter-of-fact way kids eventually develop around the hardest thing that ever happened to them. She told me once, almost a year later, that finding that phone was the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and also, somehow, the moment she started trusting me completely, because I never once lied to her about any of it, not to protect her, not to protect myself. I think about that a lot. I think it might be the single best thing to come out of the worst chapter of my life. I kept the house. I repainted the mudroom that spring, a soft yellow, nothing dramatic, just something that felt like mine instead of ours. I still teach art. I still fold laundry on Tuesdays, though it's a much smaller pile now, and folding it doesn't carry the same weight it used to. I'm not the woman who forgave in 4 seconds anymore. I don't know exactly who I am instead, not fully, not yet. But she's freer than the woman on that bottom step ever was. And she's staying. What's hardest to sit with in this story isn't Patrick's 4 affairs, it's how ordinary the machinery around them turned out to be. A sister who loved her fiercely still chose 5 years of silence because breaking it felt, in the moment, like the harder betrayal. A husband capable of real tenderness still built an entire second architecture of deception underneath it, 1 room at a time, telling himself each new room didn't count as long as he never let it become the whole house. Meredith's earlier forgiveness of Christine wasn't naivety, it was a strategy for survival that worked exactly as designed, right up until it didn't. Fast forgiveness bought her 4 more years of a marriage that felt intact. It also, without her fully realizing it, taught Patrick something quieter and more corrosive, that the consequences for this particular behavior were survivable, manageable, ultimately absorbable into the marriage's daily rhythm. That's not the same as saying she caused what came after. It's saying that systems teach the people inside them what's tolerated, whether or not anyone intends the lesson. Denise's arc is worth sitting with separately. Her silence wasn't malicious, it came from love, from not wanting to be the one who broke her sister's heart with information she hadn't asked for. But love without honesty, in that particular shape, functioned exactly like betrayal anyway. The outcome was the same regardless of the intention behind it, and that's a harder truth than a simple villain would have offered. What lingers longest is Patrick's confession, not because it excuses anything, but because it doesn't ask to. He wasn't hiding behind denial by the end. He was explaining, plainly, a fear so old it had outlived every version of success he'd achieved. Understanding where cruelty comes from doesn't obligate anyone to keep absorbing it. Meredith believed him and left anyway, and that combination, belief without forgiveness, turned out to be its own kind of strength, quieter than either explosive anger or total denial would have offered. That's the thread reaching past this one marriage. The people who hurt us are very often telling the truth about themselves the whole time, in small tells we choose not to read too closely, because reading them would cost more than we're ready to pay yet. The folder sits in the pantry, so to speak, for years before anyone opens it. Which leaves a question worth carrying home, whoever's listening to this. I think about all the small tells I filed away for years, the phone left in the car, the over-explained late night, my own sister's half-second pause on a phone call I wasn't really listening to. None of them were secret, exactly. They were just quiet, and I was busy, and busy is where a lot of truths go to wait. Here's what I'd want you to take from this, if anything, knowing the truth doesn't always arrive on your own timeline, and that's not a failure on your part. Sometimes it takes a 12-year-old finding a phone behind a boot bin to do what 6 years of half-noticed tells never managed. And when it finally arrives, you're allowed to believe someone's explanation completely and still walk away from them completely. Those two things aren't in conflict, whatever anyone tells you. If this story stirred something in you, a silence you're still sitting inside, a person who protected someone else's secret instead of your peace, tell me one word in the comments. Just the word. Thank you for staying with me through this one. It's not an easy story to tell even now, 2 years past that Tuesday in the mudroom, but I hope it found you exactly when you needed it to.